So people are starting to, oh, I'm good. Yeah, so people are starting to trickle in, so I guess I'll just start. So hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is the first in a series of webinars the PEI Fight for Affordable Housing hopes to put on to kind of go through like the starting steps of how to organize tenants and a community to like help improve the conditions of housing. My name's Connor Kelly, as you can see in the thing there. This specific webinar, like the topic is that we can win, which is basically just we're going to be hearing stories from different tenant unions or tenant organizations from across the country, telling stories of how they were in different situations similar to ours, and how organizing into different tenant associations or unions or anything like that helped them like face the issues they were struggling against and eventually like win. So we have 3 different organizations. We have 2 people from Parkdale Organize who their organization has successfully run like rent strikes and other kinds of actions to help like fight evictions and get repairs done in their buildings. The speakers from Parkdale are Patterson Hodgson and Cole Weber. 1 second, I got a restart notice, which would be really bad timing. But and then a second speaker is Sydney Blum from Nova Scotia ACORN, and Nova Scotia ACORN recently managed to win rent control for Nova Scotia. So now landlords can't raise the rent above something like 2% a year, where before it wasn't anywhere near that controlled. And that was during COVID, like in December that happened, I think. And then the last speaker is Mariah Gillis from the Vancouver Tenants Union. And she'll be talking about how the Vancouver Tenant Union's negotiated compensation for tenants during the eviction process and how they organize the communities to help provide support to tenants. So tonight we're going to hear from each of them. That'll take around roughly half an hour. It's not like a dead set time, but and after that we'll have a question and answer period where if any questions come up throughout their stories, feel free to ask them, and then we'll have a discussion and try and see how the issues on PEI parallel the issues that they've fought and won against. And just as a heads up, this call is being recorded. None of your names will show up unless you speak, so you don't have to speak. You can use the chat function if you'd like, and then we'll pass along the question. And also everyone is muted except for the speakers, just to prevent any like accidental noise from moving all the cameras around. But with that, I think I'll pass it off to Parkdale to start. So I'll mute myself and if you're good to start, or yeah.
Hi, thanks, Connor. First of all, yeah, thanks for having us. It's nice to get a chance to talk to you all tonight. My name's Cole. I'm going to speak briefly before Patterson does. So, I mean, the theme for tonight is about winning. And I guess I'll start by saying that I think that sort of the approach, the political orientation that you that we take to the work is going to set us up in one way or another. And so it's important to consider. So for us, I mean, in Parkdale Organize, we believe that, you know, working class people need independent organizations through which we can wage struggles in our interests. And so by independent, I mean specifically organizations which don't rely on politicians, you know, nonprofit or social service groups or any other kind of outside group that may have interests that are separate from ours. So we're a neighborhood group. We understand that our job is basically to aid in the formation of independent working class organization. And so we organize at the level of the neighborhood because we see the neighborhood as sort of this discrete physical environment where working class people live, interact, and struggle. And so, there's lots of struggles that people face. I mean, it's not just with landlords over evictions and rents and living conditions, but also around, conditions in our schools for our kids' education, around the services that we need, around police, immigration authorities, and of course with bosses at work. So, we see the neighborhood as the place where working class people experience this myriad of daily struggles. And our practice is to try to intervene in those struggles to help people get organized. So Parkdale itself is a neighborhood of about 20,000 people living in an area of less than 2 square kilometers. So it's a dense renter district in the west part of Toronto. Most people live in mid and high-rise apartment buildings along the main streets of the neighborhood. The rental market really does exert a lot of pressure on tenants here, obviously, like they do increasingly everywhere. Average rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Parkdale is still around $1,100 in terms of what people pay, but market rent for the same apartment, if you were going out to rent one today, is upwards of $1,600. So there's this financial incentive that landlords have to evict sitting tenants because there is a form of rent control where if a unit has a tenant living in it, the rent can only be raised incrementally, bit by bit, once a year. Once the tenant is out of the unit, there's no limit whatsoever on what the landlord can do in terms of raising rent. So the apartment buildings in the neighborhood really are kind of like the basic physical and social unit for working class organization in the neighborhood. It's in apartment buildings where committees of tenants can be formed so people can start making decisions together. And in terms about like how we go about it, I mean, in some instances, tenants will reach out to us and we'll sort of help them along or help guide them in setting up a committee. Other times we'll learn about a situation through our members or other people in the neighborhood, and then we'll just take it upon ourselves to intervene in that situation by going door to door in the building, reaching out to the tenants however we can. So just so you know how we got started, it was back in 2015. A new company in town that was buying up buildings in the rental market bought up 4 buildings in Parkdale. We learned from tenants that were living in those buildings that they were evicting people, they had removed superintendents, people couldn't get anything fixed, so on. So the tenants in those buildings formed committees, and we worked with them to wage what ended up being a fairly successful campaign to beat some rent increases and improve conditions in the apartment. So that the landlord called it Achilles. So all that to say, there are these sort of catalytic moments. There are situations that come up that kind of catalyze people and prepare them to participate in struggle. And so when Achilles bought up those 4 buildings, that was a moment. In 2017, another landlord called Metcalf, which owns a lot of buildings in the neighborhood, tried to raise rents in 5 buildings at one time. That ended up kicking off a rent strike that over 300 tenants participated in and was ultimately successful. That was another catalyst. Even just a couple of years ago, when the Conservatives came to power in Ontario, they started announcing cuts to schools and services and everything else, and that was pissing people off in the neighborhood, and it was a moment that people organized around. So having Parkdale Organize as a neighborhood group that kind of has this baseline of political unity among its members, it creates a situation where there's people in the neighborhood who are prepared to intervene when those moments occur. And yeah, that's been important for us over the past number of years. Patterson's going to talk now more about organizing at the level of the actual building.
Hi, everyone. My name is Patterson, and I live in a building called West Lodge Towers in Parkdale. And, you know, I think our situation, so I'm going to talk about us as an example of one of those tenant committees that is aided by and sparked by the work that Parkdale Organize has done. Now, our building is really different than maybe any situation in in PEI, because my building has over 700 units. So there's a lot of people living in my building. It's a different situation, but the organizing that we do is very similar to organizing that happens around any issue amongst any group of people. So in my building, when we really started earnestly organizing, at least in my experience with organizing at the building, just this year. There's been organizing that's happened in my building in the past, and that organizing in the past has laid some foundations for the organizing that's happening now. Like when organizing happens, then organizing in the future becomes easier, because people start understanding what organizing is. When there's a history of organizing in a neighborhood like Parkdale, it makes it that much easier to start organizing in a building that, even if they haven't organized at all before, because there's just that history and that support network. Those networks have already been formed. Just to say, sometimes organizing doesn't work out, as it has in my building. It's started and stopped and started and stopped, but it's always building. So. Yeah, so in my building, when COVID hit, it became really obvious that a lot of people were not going to be able to pay rent, and that was true across the city, which is why the group Keep Your Rent was launched as well. And the way we started trying to organize in my building was simply just trying to find people that were in that situation. And so a really important part of organizing is finding people that have those, like Cole said, there's a lot of reasons people struggle, and finding those common struggles are really important. But also we can support each other in struggles we're not necessarily experiencing ourselves, but starting in organizing is great, is like easier, and just works better when you have like a common struggle. And so the common struggle in my building was we can't pay rent. And as organizing has gone on for 10 months now, new common struggles have appeared. So like issues with the landlord neglecting repairs, like issues people's units. We've also realized that there's a food security issue in our building, partly because of COVID and lost income. So we've actually, in response to that, we've started a tenant-run food bank. And so how this can be taken and put on any organizing situation is that we as a group came together, we started learning about each other, we started having conversations, and you learn about what your common struggles are, or what the struggles of your neighbors are, and your community members are, and then you can decide together how you're going to set goals, how you're going to decide what to do, and then you can carry out those decisions that you make. I mean, I might just like very quickly go through just like a couple of things that have happened in the building, but I feel like the question and answer period might be the most interesting and useful if people have questions about specific organizing stuff. But here in my building, the way we make decisions is essentially, if somebody has an issue, like they're not getting the response they need from the landlord, or they're worried the landlord's doing something, or whatever the issue is, they get in contact with people they know. It's not necessarily a one-point person. It's like, could be just their neighbor that they know is organizing, or it could be me because they have my number, and they might let us know something, and then we can talk as a group, sometimes just one-on-one, about how we could confront this issue. Whether that, like, there's a lot of different ways to confront an issue. Sometimes it's just talking to the landlord. Sometimes it's a group letter. Sometimes it's a visit. Sometimes it's bigger than that. Sometimes it's actually fixing that problem, like starting our food bank. I directly addressed the idea that there's food insecurity in the building. And then, like I said, we make decisions together and then carry them out together. And that's just like a format or a framework or whatever. Then I would also say one thing is that at my building that's become really clear this year is that there are so many people you can organize with across so many lines. Like, you can organize with your neighbors that have the same landlord as you, like maybe people in your building or people in other buildings that have the same landlord as you, but you can also just organize with people who are your neighbors nearby. They don't have to have the same landlord. They don't even have to have the same problems as you. But if you live nearby, you can help each other and you can organize. And we've seen lots of people able to support each other regardless of whether they have the exact same issue or the same landlord. I feel like I had more things I was going to say, but I'm kind of blanking now. I think I'm good for now. I'm happy to take questions in the future.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you. Yeah, I think we'll definitely be coming back to some of that in the question and answer period. But next up's Sydney from Nova Scotia ACORN.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me on. Yeah, really excited to be here, talk about the rent control win. I've made a small PowerPoint because I'm a visual person. So I'm gonna try to work out the screen share. We did a trial run of this, so let's see. All right, got it? Let's do this. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the rent control win, kind of how we led up to that. Originally, we're going to address some of the challenges that we ran into when it came to, like actually getting through the, storm that is provincial politics. But really, I mean, the only issue was that the Liberals were refusing to do it, and obviously it's a necessary policy. So that's really just what we had to break through. So we're going to be talking a bit about like grassroots organizing and how do you turn, building unions, community unions into sort of winning political victories for tenants across the board. Quick little bit about us. So, ACORN, we are a multi-issue union of low and moderate income people. And the idea is we're like a working class union of people fighting for large scale social and economic justice. But what that really translates to is we fight for what our communities want to fight for, right? So we organize groups in neighborhoods, in buildings, and then they determine, what do we want to fight for? What are some of the common issues that we're having? And then how are we going to address that, right? So the way that we organize, it's very like grassroots outreach, right? So in Nova Scotia, the way we started out was going door to door, talking to neighbors, right? Like organizing lobby meetings in buildings, talking about, what do we have in common? Even in this hallway, what are we dealing with? Everybody was having plumbing issues in one of the buildings that we were talking to. And then from that, all right, how do we talk to other people in your building? And then even through that, like, what are people like tenants dealing with in the community across the board, right? So from going from organizing in individual buildings, right, to then building community groups. So when you're just starting out, I guess, like I think a lot of the groups in PEI might be, talking to your neighbors, formals like tenant committees. And then if you win and you get the things addressed, all right, like what other buildings do your landlord own, right? Go talk to them. And then even beyond that, kind of like what Patterson was saying, talk to your neighbors and see like what are the common issues and how can we all support each other like as a community, right? And then one thing that we really stress is like get big, right? There's power in numbers, build the group, and then that way you can take on bigger and bigger targets, right? We went from fighting landlords to fighting city councilors to fighting provincial politicians, and then we can go all the way up to like the federal government, So winning rent control, how do we do it? Really, yeah, like I said, it's power in numbers, right? So we were at a point where when COVID hit, we had a couple of tenants unions across Nova Scotia, but really we were able to ramp up our organizing, especially like since COVID. And we did that through like online email actions, you know, getting people to send emails to their politicians. And it started with like very common demands, right? Freeze rent, ban evictions, you know, provide rent relief, cancel rent essentially, and then you know, don't throw our neighbors out on the streets. And from that, we were able to get email contacts and do like a lot of face-to-face, like direct engagement with people, right? So calling people and asking them, what are the issues that you're having in your building? What are the issues that you're having in, you know, your neighborhood? And would you be able to, you know, providing distance, slip some flyers under people's doors, right? Go talk to your neighbors. Do you think we could get everybody on a Zoom call and talk about it, right? So really like one of the key things that we do, and I think part of the reason that we were able to like achieve this kind of victory is because everything is really tenant led, right? So our members determine everything about the organization, right? They're the people who speak to the press. I say all the time, you know, like we're not advocates, right? We're people who are really just fighting for our lives and our communities. And so with that, it's really important, like it's tenants who determine what we fight for in the buildings, and then community members determine what we fight for at that level, all the way up to the provincial and like federal level, right? And then, yeah, political engagement and education is a huge part of what we do, and like stress. You know, you could throw yourselves at the same landlords for years. And, you know, we do that, like, you know, Metcalf, Starlight, Timber Creek, all the like big offenders. We do, like, they know our names. But at the end of the day, nothing is really ever going to change unless we really mobilize people and win these sort of systemic changes and protections for renters, right? So organize a tenants union in your building, get people talking, and then find out who your city councilor is, find out who your MLA is, right? Get meetings with them, because those are the people that you can put the pressure on and really target to make these sort of systemic changes, you know? And then also, you know, making noise around a certain issue. And then with us, this was rent control, right? We had tenants constantly speaking out saying, you know, I had a $650 rent increase. We had a member who came forward, said they had a $905 a month rent increase, you know, effective evictions, right? And getting those stories out there and hearing directly from the tenants who are most affected is like really what pushed this, you know, and got council moving. But then also you do kind of need, in certain cases, an ally with the government, right, who can kind of push this as well. But really, like we had allies with the NDP, but this really all came because like tenants were speaking out and organizing, you know. And then aggressive campaign tactics. I really stress this. Do actions. Don't send an email when you could go to the property manager's office and yell at them in person, right? And keep the issue in the media. On large scale things like this, you know, you want media attention. The people who are ultimately going to be able to pass these sort of policies don't check Twitter and Instagram, right? They get a press briefing handed to them by an assistant at the beginning of the day. And if the top thing at that is renters are, you know, marching in the streets for rent control, that's what's going to eventually push that issue, right? And then we did constant actions. I mean, COVID threw us off a little bit, but at a certain point we were doing, you know, actions at people's buildings and using like the issues that people were having in one certain building to highlight how this is a bigger issue across the province, right? And in that way, you're able to win things, not just like with the landlord and with the people who are there, and then also being able to push that larger issue, right? So with rent control, we had a building out in Dartmouth that we had a tenants union in. And one of our members who are most active fighting for repairs in the building actually got a $350 a month rent increase as a retaliation for going to city bylaw and complaining about the building conditions. So we got 50 people outside the front lawn and marched to the property manager's office and stormed in and demanded they reverse the rent increase and do the repairs and treat the pests. And we won, right? And being able to highlight that people were being targeted with these sort of unfair rent increases is why we were able to also say, you know, it's not just us, it's not just these people, this is happening across the province. And like, that's why we need both of these things to change, right? Yeah, we had tenant speak outs. That's another fun action I like doing. We'd go to a very public place with a megaphone and be able to publicly call out landlords and talk about what's going on. We find that it's just really effective at getting the public discourse and also making other people realize like they're not alone in dealing with this, right? It does go beyond buildings. Everybody is dealing with bad repairs in their building, right, across the province. There are countless bad landlords that we're just never going to hear about. And so being able to get that out there in that sort of sense is really what helped push this. And then really at the end of the day, what one like tip the rent control victory for us is because these outrageous rent increases went into the press. The premier came out and said, yeah, we're never going to do rent control. It's not going to happen. It's a bad policy and it's a philosophical issue that we just disagree on. And members lost it. Yeah, the philosophical issue comment, I think, really pushed it, right? We had a rally. We organized a rally with 350 people out in front of City Hall. We marched to Province House. We said, we're going to be back every week unless you push this policy. And 5 days later, we've got rent control. So going into an election year, going into, a winter season and a pandemic that's been especially hard on people, I think that's going to be able to, let's really push that over the edge for us and make this a permanent thing. I'm just going to check my time. Okay, cool. Okay, I've got quick tips right at the end just to throw some things out. Number one, most important, I think, with any sort of organization that's coming from this is like tenants and community members really call the shots and like speak for the organization, right? You'll never see me in the press on anything, obviously, because like I just get people talking to each other and it's members who determine what it is we fight for, what the issues are, how we're going to do it, And then in that way also, it's not just a spokesperson or one person who's like the face of a movement. You can say like it's all of us, right? It's tenants across the province who are dealing with this. Solidarity with other organizations is another really big one. In the picture here, actually in the back, we've got a table with Dalhousie Legal Aid. They were handing out like tenant information packets. Yeah, it's important, especially like when you're kind of a new group and starting out, like some of the like smaller, building unions, a PEI might be. There are things we're not going to know. I didn't really know anything about the Residential Tenancies Act. We didn't have other people doing that. So being able to reach out to legal clinics for that sort of information, being able to work with, labor unions who have experience organizing and are able to disseminate information like workplaces was really helpful. Even other activists and organizations across the city who are able to like get people out there and show that, this is really a widespread movement. And then figure out the financials. I know this sounds like nitty gritty, boring accounting stuff, but it costs money to print flyers. It costs money to get a megaphone. Some groups I think rely, well, it depends. Everybody has different strategies, right? There are grants you can apply for. People get funding from the government. We work like a union, right? So our members chip in dues, and then in that way, like they own and fund the organization as well. Get as big as you can. Do as much outreach as humanly possible. Print hundreds of thousands of flyers, get big, and like be able to push these big issues. And do get political, win things in your building. And then, like I said, like go to the next one, and like make sure that you can kind of win this across the board. We've been able to do this in a lot of other cities and it's been like very successful. Rent control is one of them. We won the Rent Safe Act out in Toronto, right? Which is basically like preventing rent evictions. I think Judy Duncan, our head organizer, is like fantastic and helped really push that. And then out in BC, we've got a stellar group of people too, who are kind of kicking ass across the board, if I can be a bit crass. Well, that's it for me. I think I'll put a pause on this and then we'll address some stuff with questions. How do I end it? There we go.
Awesome, thanks. And then that leaves Mariah last, but not least. It's the usual saying.
Thank you. So my name's Mariah, she, her pronouns. I'm here from the unceded, ancestral, and stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I say that to emphasize how important that is to our work as a tenants union. Oh, by the way, I'm coming from the Vancouver Tenants Union. Because the Indigenous people were the first people to be evicted from these lands, and the concept of housing commodification, land commodification is a settler invention that wreaks irreparable harm disproportionately on Indigenous peoples. So we have to keep that in mind with the work that we do, and they're inseparable. They're connected in ways that we can never separate. So yeah, the VTU is a citywide tenants organization union with neighborhood chapters. We have working groups focused on lobbying City Hall and provincial government. The BC has a rent freeze until July this year, but there's no vacancy control, and the eviction moratorium was lifted in August. So there's more incentive than ever now for reno and dem evictions. And so this is actually an interesting point for us because PEI has vacancy control, and this is something that we've been fighting for a long time in BC. So during the question and answer period, I would actually love to hear about how vacancy control is going in PEI. Like, it's a great opportunity for us to learn from each other. So I'm really excited about that. But today I'm going to be talking about VTU's experience with negotiating with City Hall and developers in cases of reno and dem evictions. So we have two major cases to use as examples. So the first one, we usually tend to refer to cases by their address number. So the first one is 326 Nanaimo, which is in the neighborhood of Hastings Sunrise, which is one of the last actually affordable neighborhoods in Vancouver. Again, affordable in the Vancouver context might sound kind of ridiculous to everyone else because the idea of affordable here is kind of laughable, probably to the rest of the country. But at this building, they were issued an eviction notice in December of 2018. And then in January of 2019, just a month later, the city issued a memo to tenants that promised developers would have to provide 3 relocation options of similar size and within 10% of current rents that they were paying. So that would be $1,100 for a 2-bedroom apartment, which is almost unheard of right now in Vancouver. So that kind of sets the stage for how unrealistic this requirement is. And one of those options from the developer would have to be within the same neighborhood. And so this is called the Tenant Relocation Protection Policy from the City of Vancouver. And so the developer is technically required to follow this policy by the city, but there's no enforcement, as we'll see. So the tenants actually didn't hear anything from the developer until less than a month before the eviction date of September 7th, 2019. And when they did hear from the developer, they just ended up getting a bunch of Craigslist ads that did not meet the TRP requirements. So they were much further out of the price range of the tenants, what the tenants were able to pay. They were not in the neighborhood. And they, if they were within the price range, it didn't provide the same amount of space, not the same number of bedrooms, that kind of stuff. And often, you know, even if one of these listings would come within the neighborhood of being affordable, they disappear. They get snapped up immediately, right? So it's all kind of like a pointless process of having somebody from the developer just send tenants Craigslist postings as if tenants can't just go on Craigslist themselves. The developer ended up hiring a PR firm called Reside Tenancy Relations. So the TRP policy from the city has actually ended up creating a new, what we call a parasite role for a PR specialist to act as a middleman between the developer and the tenants. And basically all they do is send these Craigslist postings and try to negotiate, quote unquote, with the tenants, but there's really not much leeway that the tenants can get from the developers. So after sending these Craigslist posts, the developer stonewalled negotiation attempts with the tenants, which caused 3 of the tenants to leave without a deal. And some of those tenants ended up paying more than 50% than their previous rents for their new apartments. And the remaining tenants held a rally with the Vancouver Tenants Union, and we urged our members to send letters to the city calling for them to enforce the TRP, to actually force the developer to provide realistic options to the tenants. And then city staff told the tenants that in negotiations that the relocation had to be done on terms that were fair to the developer. Apparently it doesn't matter whether the terms are fair to the tenant, but they have to be fair to the developer. And then the final remaining tenant who held out in the end ended up getting 8 months of a rent top up from the developer through months of negotiation. But the city told the developer that they owed nothing to the tenants who had left earlier under duress with no deal. So basically you have to have the energy and the fortitude to go through months of negotiation for the roof over your head to get anything out of the developer. So effectively what we learned from this is that the tenant relocation protection policy just puts a price tag on displacement and provides a template for developers to work with City Hall to plan displacement. And it facilitated, like I said, the new type of parasite role, a tenant relocation specialist, basically a PR middleman for the developer / landlord. And so if you're in Vancouver and you're in a building facing demoviction or renoviction, bargain if you can, but be aware that it takes a lot of time and energy that most tenants don't have, because it's hard enough to be a low-income person without having to fight for the roof over your head. And so the tenant relocation protection policy is broken fundamentally, and there's zero enforcement from the city. So ultimately, what is the point? So after this, in the fall during the pandemic, VTU ended up taking on the case of a building at Broadway in Carolina. It involved an elderly disabled Filipino couple fighting against a developer called Port Living who wanted to demolish the building that they were in order to build like fancy condo towers, basically, which is the story of Vancouver. So for context, for a while, basically the way VTU chapters run is that we gather around particular fights like 326 Nanaimo and Broadway, Carolina. And then once they're done, kind of disperse. So chapters gather and disperse and gather and disperse. So again, once this fight started to happen, the Mount Pleasant chapter, which hadn't been regularly active for some time, quickly organized around this case. And it galvanized the neighborhood, which has been the site of gentrification for years and is becoming less and less accessible to low-income residents. Again, the city insisted that any negotiations needed to be fair to the developer, who were, again, not following the requirements of the TRP, sending useless Craigslist ads that would do nothing for this low-income disabled elderly couple. And the only reason that the tenants were able to negotiate anything is because of the neighborhood support that the union organized. And we managed to publicly shame the developer and call attention citywide to what they were doing. And now the Mount Pleasant chapter is trying to stay together and continue to organize around displacement. And I think we actually have some Mount Pleasant chapter members here today. So if they want to chime in potentially during the Q&A, that would be great. And so, yeah, that's the gist of it. I threw this together really last minute. So if there are any questions, hopefully I can answer them.
Yeah, no, that was great. We'll move on to the question and answer period then. There's a few questions that came in during registration. So while people come up with questions, I'll read one or two of those off. The first one is somebody asking like how to ensure that a tenants organization, like in this particular question, the tenants union, how to make sure it's actually a union that's rooted in building committees rather than like becoming just like another like activist group that puts social pressure, or like is like an advocacy group rather than like a tenants union. And that's up for any of the speakers to answer.
Yeah.
Also, just to clarify, to ask a question, just type something up in the chat and send it to everyone.
Yeah, I think on this question of like organizing that's based in like an area, and that's organizations that are composed of and controlled by renters themselves, working class people themselves. I think that's critical. I think like what you heard from Patterson was talking about how tenants relate to each other in a specific building. So like in Parkdale, because there's this high density of renters and all these apartment buildings, it does make the most sense for organization to be at the level of the building, at the base level. And so it's always been our focus to try to help people establish these committees based in apartment buildings. Now, in a different context where it's less dense and you're working with people over maybe a larger physical area, I guess it's a matter of trying to determine or trying to learn what is sort of like the basic unit of organization. But I think the same principle still basically applies, is that you're in developing and trying to help people develop organization. It's about bringing people together and creating a space for people to actually make decisions together. So like in that sense, like a success is not so much like as an activist recruiting people to a specific campaign necessarily, but more so success looks like have people actually come together, made a decision, followed through on it, and seen some kind of result from it. Thanks.
Can I go next?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so just on the topic of unions, or what makes a union really a union, or whatever, here at my building in West Lodge, we so far have made a fairly conscious decision to not formalize the structure of our tenant group. And one of the reasons for that is because, I mean, I personally have seen, but also people that Parkdale have seen, issues come out of formalizing the structure into sort of a tenants association or a union or whatever you decide to be. The thing about organizing is that it should be dynamic. You should be able to do whatever you need to do to respond to whatever an issue is. Now, sometimes the issue, like what they're doing in Nova Scotia, is a large policy-based issue that maybe you want to do a really large campaign, and maybe you do need more structure for that. I'm not even really of the opinion, but for us in my building, the issues are fairly simple and straightforward, and the issues are usually that someone is being mistreated, or someone is having a hard time getting something done, or a group of us are having a hard time. For instance, so at my building, in the spring, so we were doing flyering because we couldn't really do door knocking because of COVID. And as we were doing flyering, we happened to have mail slots in our doors. And so we started noticing that there were a lot of empty units. And it became clear to us that our landlord was keeping units vacant. So that's an issue that's affecting all of my building, right? That's not just a one-person issue. And we had a meeting, and what we decided to do was we would go to the press about it. We didn't have to have a union And the press, they did confirm with our landlord that there were 150 empty units, which we think is ballooned to 200. So that's what developers and landlords are doing in Toronto. They're messing with our communities, right? And there's a housing crisis here, as I believe there is in PEI as well. I believe there's like an extreme, and so it's very similar, they're keeping units vacant for whatever reason here. People are keeping them vacant because of tourism and PEI. That's an issue you can organize around. And to respond to that, you don't necessarily need a formalized structure. You just need people that are facing that struggle, that believe in that what's happening is wrong, to work together. And sometimes structure helps us work together, but sometimes it hinders us as well. So that's what I would say about, I have lots of thoughts on these questions, but I'll let someone else hop in first.
I think for us, the main thing is direct democracy. The difference between a union and just like an advocacy organization is that we're made up of our members and we don't exist without our members. And our members are the ones that do everything. We don't have any paid staff, we're all volunteers. And so we can't make decisions without the input of our members. Even our steering committee, we're a non-hierarchical organization. So our steering committee is just a sampling of our members and it represents the views of our members. And so I think there's a lot of value in that, because at the end of the day, the decisions we make are based on what is affecting the people that we're advocating for, which is ourselves. We're advocating for ourselves. And so that makes it more tangible, I guess. And when we advocate to government officials or to the media or whoever, we can say, we're advocating for vacancy control, for instance, because this is what we, our members, ourselves, this is what we need to fight the housing crisis, to get affordable housing, to fight displacement, versus like just some advocacy organization that has like a bunch of, career, like nonprofit industrial complex organizers can't necessarily say that, right? So yeah.
No. Is there anything you want to add, Sydney, or are you?
Yeah, it's more or less been covered by everyone who's already spoken, but really it is, sticking almost to basics in a sense. Dealing with issues in your building, make sure that you're regularly having meetings and checking in with your neighbors, right? The people who are involved, that's how you're going to be able to respond to things that are happening at that level. And then also like having that support system in the community where people can, show up even if you do have small numbers and you're just starting out in a building, right? Having people who can be there and like show that there's like strength and support throughout the neighborhood is also really important, right? Yeah, I'll go down on that.
That's good. Somebody asked the best way to develop sort of chapters, or I guess another way to word it is, what have you found is the best way to like start forming groups, or if like either a building's too big or a neighborhood's too large, how to start creating like groups that can cover sections of an area? Because I know at least with like PEI, everybody's too spread out. Like Charlotte's 30,000 people, but spread out over like a city-sized space. So the best way to like create chapters that cross over an area.
I might just give an example about the Keep Your Rent movement here in Toronto that has sprung up during COVID. I don't think that there's necessarily a way to strategically go and try and set up chapters that will be successful at least in the way that we in Parkdale would like to see. Because like everyone has said, it's best when people involved in that area or involved in that issue are the part of that group organizing. But I think when you start organizing, And it can be over vast areas. I mean, COVID has been a great learning for online communication and ways to stay in touch that is not necessarily in person. But I think you have to just start organizing and like as narrow as possible. Real, I think like the narrower you go, the easier time you're going to have. Like if you pick something small, especially if you win at that something small, you're going to like build that confidence, right? But expanding geographically, it should happen slowly, unless you're experiencing a lot of like interest. But I don't think you need to like think about really big right away. Like you could start in just one, like you could start at one crossroads, you know, 4 houses. Organizing can happen, even in my building, organizing can happen just on a floor. You know, everyone on a floor can decide that something needs to happen and make that happen. I feel like Cole would also have like a lot of insight.
No, I agree with that. I think trying not to think up like an elaborate structure and then impose it on the city is probably the way to go, and rather just kind of see what develops. Like your new initiative, so you're probably going to be putting out, you know, posters, outreach materials, just to try to generate contacts with tenants. So as you develop contacts and have conversations with people, just see where that leads. And I think once you have the experience of following through from start to finish of an organizing drive, for lack of a better word, like once you come into some contact with some tenants who want to do something about some conditions that they're facing, see how that develops and see what kind of attention that attracts from other tenants. And so I think, yeah, I agree with Patterson. Just start small, see what happens, and then whenever and document what you're doing for people to see, so that like you can kind of reflect back to people in your area what's going on. So I mean, we obviously do that online and stuff, but one tool that was somewhat effective for us was like a neighborhood newsletter. So we would print up, even just in the early days, even just interviews with local tenants about, you know, about their connection to the neighborhood, how long they've lived there, maybe they immigrated from a different country, and what their experience has been like in Canada. And we just kind of put together newsletters that reflected the neighborhood's experience back to it. And that was helpful in sort of people feeling more open to approach us about what it is they were facing.
I think I would also just add, like along with what Cole said, where he said, see what develops. Start organizing, see where you're feeling success, see where you're feeling feedback that is positive from people you're talking to. You know, that's also a great answer to how do we not become an activist or just an activist organization. Like when you're talking to people, figure out what they're upset about, what they're worried about, or figure out what maybe they don't realize they should be upset about. Like that, you know, you may not get someone like from like zero to like, let's burn down capitalism, but like, it's not hard to like talk to somebody, talk to a group of people and understand what direction you could go in. This sounds like when you're a tenant, there are so many issues that you can tackle. It can be about a landlord or about policy or about all these different things, but you're going to find like which issues people care about the most. And those issues are the ones to press. And then start expanding.
Really good point.
Yeah, I would just say to add in as well, I think the idea of building community is really important as well. Like that newspaper sounds like a great idea. Like that's so totally something that we would do here as well. And, you know, with the Mount Pleasant chapter, you know, the one fight that we were going through at Broadway, Carolina, it galvanized the neighborhood because it was an example of what's happening to so many people every day for years and years and years. And it got people to gather around that one fight as a way of fighting for the neighborhood as a whole and not just this one unit, you know? And so I think like as long as, you know, the people in the neighborhood feel strongly that, you know, the campaign that you're working on is meaningful and that it's actually going to, you know, achieve something, then like that's what you need, right? And what else was I going to say? Oh, I forgot. Okay, well, anyway, I just totally blanked on what else I was going to say. But yeah, I think maintaining community is really important. Something that happens with our Mount Pleasant chapters now is, you know, we always talk about like what's going on in the neighborhood. Recently, there was a block, mostly commercial block, that had a major fire that destroyed a bunch of businesses, or at least heavily impacted them. So we spent a lot of time talking about that and how that would affect the neighborhood, and you know what the chapter could do to help with that, or like what we should be on the lookout for as a result of that. And yeah, just like keep up with the people in your neighborhood and what's going on, and the issues will come up. They'll come to you as long as you're engaged.
That is a really good point. When you start organizing, it becomes really, it's like problems just come to you. When you start, and that's the point. You want to know what's going on and be able to mobilize and respond to what's going on. And those are those catalytic moments. Like when you start building a base and something happens, like a policy comes into play that you think is, or developer comes to town, stuff like Cole said, or yeah, like even as the tourist season fades in and out, you know, like those are moments where you can respond to what's happening as it happens. And when you start organizing, those things will just kind of start happening. I got a question privately that I would maybe address. It was let me find it. Curious, express fear of retribution for speaking up. And I think probably every single person on this panel could speak to that. Very briefly, yes, people are frequently afraid. I've been organizing solidly for 10 months in my building, which is not that long. So it's not surprising to me, but people still, like just today, I'll call for someone who's upset about something and I'll say, let's go to the office, and they're afraid. But I will say that the point of organizing, people don't have to be afraid. And so that people are stronger when they go together, when they do something together, because you have people to back them up. But I also suspect everyone might have stories of how they have assuaged people's fears.
Yeah, I mean, there's the fear that people have is real, and it's a reasonable fear to have, right? Because like landlords do retaliate against people. They try to make people's lives difficult, and sometimes they target people who speak out. So that's a real thing. I think it's important to establish from the beginning of any effort, like if tenants who have the same landlord, for example, who are in the same area, right at the beginning, it's like we're committing now to backing up anybody who gets any shit for what we're doing. And that, you know, if that happens, then we all commit now to making sure that that is addressed, and we're all going to back each other up on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'll say that in the Broadway Carolina case, the elderly Filipino couple, they were really afraid to go public. You know, they had a lot of, I guess, hangups about being immigrants and, you know, not having perfect English, but also just like being afraid to be in the public eye and fighting a giant developer. And would it affect their future housing prospects? Would they be effectively blacklisted within, you know, the landlord community, I guess? And the way that our organizers worked with them to give them the confidence to put themselves in the public eye was to basically talk about how, you know, they could set an example and really like make positive change in the neighborhood and inspire other people to fight back. And, you know, now they are just like so grateful. They're the sweetest. They send the organizers that they worked with like Christmas cards, and they talk on the phone regularly. And, you know, the wife, you know, she said that this experience just gave her so much confidence and has really like changed her mindset about her power in the world, and you know, what she's capable of. So it's a very real fear that we can't diminish, but I think that the potential to empower people to fight back and realize their power is really serious as well. And it's just so awesome to see people accept that and like really internalize it. And also just a funny thing is that, so in Vancouver, we have a bunch of landlord Facebook groups where they share tips and bitch about tenants and whatever. And so as organizers, of course, we are in those groups to monitor them, right? So there was one group where the landlords were complaining about us as the Tenants Union and saying that they should make a plan to have a landlord go undercover and join the Tenants Union to try and get like a list of all our members to form a blacklist, which is illegal. And obviously, since we caught it, it would be pretty hard for them to do it, right? We have data protection policies in place and everything. But it was really funny. And it's also a case of, yeah, there is real danger. You know, for the members of the union that are more public with our involvement, there is a real risk that, you know, if you speak to the media, for instance, and you use your name, you're Googleable now as a tenant organizer. And if you're trying to find a new place and you put an application in and they Google your name, they might decide not to rent to you. And it's not a buyer's market here. Like, you know, they can easily they can just as easily choose to rent to somebody who's not an agitator. And they might as well, right? Especially if you're looking for like affordable housing and it's really competitive, they will. So it's a real risk you take, but you have to make that decision for yourself and decide whether it's worth it. And yeah, ultimately, you know, being part of a community, you may take the risk of being put on a blacklist, but you know, with being part of the community, it also gives you opportunities to work with the community to, you know, find the housing that you need. So yeah, there was a question in the chat about like public pressure, and I just wanted to say as well that the developer in the second case in Mount Pleasant, Port Living, the public pressure really worked with them in particular because they brand themselves as being part of the community and supporting artists and, you know, like being a cool developer, basically. So putting that public pressure on them and showing the neighborhood that they're not what they say they are not part of the community, they're ruining the community, that really worked. And the funny thing is, Vince, one of the main chapter organizers, he has a poster behind him that you'll see whenever he's on Zoom calls now that says, Port Living millions in debt or something like that, ha ha ha, because that's what ended up happening. The developer was actually in debt already and not likely to actually follow through on any of their development plans, even though they were still pursuing the STEM eviction. And so we made that public and shamed them and really embarrassed them and showed like the city that they're not as benevolent as they make themselves out to be. And they're also just like not very well organized. They're not like good at business. So that was really effective. And I think that public shaming can be effective in a case like PEI. I'm actually from Fredericton. I grew up in Fredericton. And so like, I kind of understand like the small city like mentality a little bit. And I think something that business owners in small communities like to do is to say that they're part of the community, that they are doing positive things. You know, landlords like to frame themselves as housing providers, right? Like that's so benevolent. But if you shame them and show the community that they are not providing housing, they're extorting low-income people, that works. I think it really does. So definitely like shame them, take the opportunity for sure. Like, you know, I think it could be really effective.
Yeah, out in
go ahead.
yeah, out in Nova Scotia, I think we have sort of a similar situation as PEI in some senses, because we have a chapter in Antigonish, which is actually, I think, just like right down the street from you guys, or bridge. Yeah, and it's a small community. People know each other, and the landlords are typically like small time landlords, right? They have buildings with, you know, 6 or 8 units in them, or they own a couple houses around town, right? And to be able to like name them, to be able to show up at their house and say like, we're here at your house because you won't fix ours, or you're, you know, and even just getting that in the local paper. I think at one point we put like wanted ads around town, like wanted crimes of being a slumlord, something along the lines of like, here's all the things they're doing in their buildings and tenants are fed up. Here's a landlord's phone number. Give them a call if you want to share thoughts. And that was like extremely effective at getting a landlord to repair like 16 units across like Antigonish, right? It's shaming them is like is a very, very, very effective public tactic. Shaming doesn't work. Hit them where it hurts, you know, try to get their wallets. Yeah, name and shame. I love it. Yeah, mom and pop landlords especially. Just reading the chat, sorry.
Yeah, but no. I think the Tenants Union back in the 70s on PEI did a bit of shaming, and it's really funny to look back at their newspaper, because they do like landlord of the month, so like the worst landlord. But
I think tenant organizing, all organizing, but tenant organizing creates consequences for landlords. And we need to, that's what we're doing. We're creating consequences. If you're going to treat our neighbors poorly, if you're going to neglect their buildings, if you're going to charge exorbitant rent, if you're going to keep units vacant when there's people who need homes, there's going to be consequences. And shaming is one of those consequences. Like, you're not going to be able to do this in secret. If you do this, everyone's going to know that you're doing this. And that's what all organizing and on all levels is really about. We cannot let people like do this in safety and in mysteriously behind some veil. Like, if people are going to, in Toronto, I mean, this is certainly happening in PEI to a lesser degree, but in Toronto, landlords buy buildings and push people out and change who gets to live there. And we don't let them do that in secret. Even if they do it and we lose, we still won if we made it known that they've done this, and that continues to be a win. Like, Keep Your Rent is working for rent forgiveness and to keep people in their homes during COVID and because of non-payment during COVID. It's a huge battle, and people are being evicted still. People have been evicted during COVID. People are having eviction notices, like orders. They're in hearings. They're getting evicted. So people are getting evicted. But it's not in secret. It's not. People know that these people are being evicted. And if Keep Your Rent hadn't started, this would all be happening behind closed doors. People wouldn't even know about it. And that's a huge part of why we organize.
yeah, I think the accountability, like making landlords accountable when they haven't been, is like a really big thing. And also thanks, Cole, for answering the legal repercussions question, which if just anybody else hasn't read it yet, it's basically you can get threatened for defamation, but you just have to tell the truth, and that way it's not libel or slander. Which,
Yeah, I mean, the thing about landlords is, like, to be honest, like, as a class, like, obviously there's a power dynamic there between landlords and tenants. They're rich, they have more power in society. But as people, like as a class, they are some of the just most pathetic and weak-kneed people that you'll ever find. And they cry and cry and cry whenever you do anything. So like they have most of them that we deal with have no concept of what it is to like earn your money or like struggle in any kind of way. So they have no actual like fortitude as human beings. So you can get under their skin pretty easy.
Yeah, and they have no defense. They take passive income from owning a property. That's the work they do. The work they do is own land. That's the job. It's not a job. They just take our money because they own the land that we're living on. Like it's indefensible. And you just have to point that out and make it real, make it public, and popularize that idea amongst everyone. And eventually, when everybody in Canada agrees with that, then one day maybe we'll abolish landlords because we don't need them.
Yeah, and the other thing is that like as much as like landlords can be sometimes can be, you know, cruel and vicious and detestable, a lot of it doesn't necessarily, like, it's not a personal thing on a certain level, right? It's like this is the way that things are structured in capitalist society. Property is privately owned. Landlords are allowed to extract rent from people in exchange for people to have any kind of shelter. So like in a sense it gets personal, but it's also just very impersonal. So we have to keep that in mind as well, because that becomes a dynamic in organizing as well, where tenants will, like especially with smaller landlords, tenants will have personal relationships with the landlord or with the employees of the landlord, and they don't necessarily want to, you know, make the landlord out to be a bad guy, or they're sensitive about what relationships that they're in. So sometimes it is good to just talk about that as well, as that, you know, whether your landlord's a nice guy or not, it's kind of besides.
I'm wondering if folks from PEI can talk about their experience with vacancy control, because that's like something that in BC we're really interested in. We've been fighting for a long time.
yeah, I was going to ask that as well to anybody else from Fight for Affordable Housing, because I didn't realize that we had vacancy control.
Oh, that.
Yeah, I'm not sure you do.
Oh, okay.
Because our vacancy rate was 0.2% before COVID.
Well, I mean, the vacancy control that I'm referring to is basically that that rent is tied to the unit instead of the individual tenant. So if a tenant moves out currently here, the landlord can raise the rent as much as they want, because the rent controls don't apply to when the tenancy changes. It only applies to ongoing tenancies. So basically it creates an incentive to rent evict tenants so that the landlord has an opportunity to raise the rent. But with vacancy control, it wouldn't allow for that.
Oh yeah, no, we do have that.
Okay.
And it does work when the tenants know that. A lot of tenants don't know that, and the onus is on the tenants on PEI that they have to be the ones to report it if their neighbors can't. There's one instance where that actually came up, where somebody's neighbor told them that the previous tenant had paid way less in rent, so there had been an illegal rent increase. But had their neighbor not told them that, they wouldn't have been able to get they got, I'm not sure how much in rent they got paid back, but it was a significant amount.
Okay, yeah, that's really good to know.
Right in the chat, they got $5,000 back.
Is there any kind of
I was just going to add that there's so little enforcement of it. Like, that's the really big issue, is that, sorry, my dogs are barking. The really big issue is that they don't track rents. There's no registry of what it was. And as soon as you leave the unit, like your rights are done. Like you can't see it listed for $200 more and go put it in an appeal. Like it's absolute bullshit. So it's kind of there. There's kind of ways to, like Connor mentioned, like kind of go back, and if you can kind of backtrack or find somebody, but it's really poorly administered.
Yeah, in Vancouver, we have been organizing around it for a couple of years now. And in BC, we actually had vacancy control in the 70s when we had an NDP government then, and then it was undone by the Conservative government that came in afterwards. So, you know, we have the ability to say that we did it and it worked before, but it doesn't seem to be catching on at all. So it's good to hear about what it's actually like in PEI, because that gives us a perspective about, you know, the pitfalls that we could get if we get it here.
I'm kind of curious, like, what do you view as like the main issues tenants in PEI are facing? Like in Toronto, for instance, like high rents. There's no rent control there's no vacancy rent control. That's a big issue. There's a huge incentive to evict people. Are there easily identifiable ones?
I guess I can, maybe if each person from Fight for Affordable Housing tosses something out, or just tenants in the chat. For me, I find it's just people are very scared of repercussions, and like rent evictions have kind of become like a myth, and like it's a huge story that's always over everybody's heads. But there's been like 10 people, one person has directly been in contact with who isn't even like an advocate for housing so much as like they're just like a nonprofit developer, and they've come across 10 people who have been rent evicted in the last like 2 years.
I'm kind of the annoying short-term rental person in the group. And for a while, we had like the highest proponent of short-term rentals, like per capita. And they're like, you know, short-term rental for the summer, student housing or whatever for the winter. And you know, we know that students, that's not necessarily how they're operating now. We know that there's co-ops. We know that people go to school year round. We know international students stay here year round. We know people want to work here in the summer. So that's a pretty big problem as well. I can read some others from the chat too. So yeah, we also have a 30-year-old Tenancy Act that's in the process of being updated and has been delayed again. So really old, really outdated. Issues of rent evictions, kind of as mentioned, that keeps happening as well. And, you know, someone might say like, oh, my brother is moving in, or give kind of an excuse or valid reason for evicting a tenant, being like, oh, my brother's moving into this unit. The tenant leaves and they just relist it for more. Again, the tenant is gone. They have no ability to appeal that. There's no accountability. They don't track evictions here. It's absolutely just a huge gap, and not having any data. Sorry, someone else can jump in, Anne or Leo or.
I think one of the issues, as in a lot of other places, would be the really sort of lack of enforcement of any kind of, or lack of maintenance standards. So you've got, you know, people paying pretty substantial rents for for places that are in very poor conditions, that have, you know, that are basically unsafe and unhealthy. And again, as Connor said, there's a lot of fear around speaking out, and people, because of the vacancy rate being so low, you know, people don't feel like they have a choice. So they are stuck in some really substandard places, which I'm sure isn't just specific to PEI.
Yeah, no, a lot of that relates to what's going on in Toronto for sure. I think Cole could speak a little bit more on like the issue of rent eviction and like these bogus evictions where they're the landlord, so and so move in. Like the way I've seen organizing help stop those is simply giving the tenants in that situation the confidence to stay, the confidence to say no, the confidence to like start looking into like what's true here. You know, for instance, in know a lot of people try and use that. My relative is moving in, and that one's difficult to fight against. But just a simple start researching that landlord. Is it true? Like, do they have other properties? That, like, just simply doing that and then sending a letter can, you know, can stop that process or can slow that process.
Yeah, it's effectively the same situation in Vancouver as well. Rent eviction, like I said, there's a lot of incentive to rent evict because it's one of the only ways that you can raise the rent above the allowable limit set by rent control. So yeah, we have to do, if you're facing rent eviction, it really is, you have to do a lot of investigation on your own time. And it's really hard to prove when it's in bad faith. I was just dealing with a couple in their 70s who had their home purchased by a big fancy architect who has designed a number of big important buildings in Vancouver. And he said that he wanted the building to be vacant as part of the sale because he and his son were planning to move into either side of the duplex. This is not a nice historical home in Vancouver. It's kind of like an older, like 70s, not great duplex and like, you know, an up and coming neighborhood, right? So, you know, it's hard to believe that this big fancy architect would want to move into this mediocre duplex, but how do you prove that, right? Like, it's really just he said, she said. And so, you know, the couple ended up, they tried to contest the eviction at first. But again, you know, part of the issue with our tenancy board here is that everything is so backed up right now that hearings are being scheduled after the original date of eviction. So if you lose the hearing, you only have 2 days to vacate the unit. And so when I was talking to this couple and I explained that to them, they said, that's way too much stress. Like, how are we supposed to prepare for that? You know, basically, in order to be properly prepared, you have to have another place lined up in case you lose. If you win, then you're stuck with 2 places. And in their case, their hearing was scheduled for March 5th. So they would have had to pay the entire rent for the month of March. And if they lost, there's no guarantee that they would get the prorated amount back. So they were basically pushed to withdraw their dispute just by bureaucratic attrition and by the fact that it didn't seem likely that they would be able to win because it's so hard to prove that the eviction was in bad faith. So yeah, it's a pretty terrible situation. And now their new apartment that they just moved into is, I think they told me $300 more, and it's not as nice. The ceilings are really low. It's a basement apartment. And so, yeah. And they ended up having a bunch of health problems due to the stress of the entire thing. So yeah, that's the situation here.
I mean, COVID has made it kind of impossible here, but like traditionally what we've relied on a lot too are just like kind of neighborhood wide meetings. So we would hold meetings like at the local library in the neighborhood and then just like flyer door to door in the apartment buildings, inviting people to come out and then inviting anybody who was contacting us with problems that they were having that meeting as well. So because one of the dynamics that you don't want to get too much into is like dealing with everybody's problem one at a time, like one by one, because you will have people coming, you know, looking for you to solve their problem or whatever. But the whole point of the thing obviously is to collectivize people's problems and get people working together. So, you know, public health crisis permitting, getting people together in the same room or outside somewhere to have talk about these things in groups and doing like targeted outreach to places in your city where there's renters would be good too.
How's everybody doing for time? Like, I'd be happy to keep going. I just want to make sure I'm not like holding anybody up too much in their evening. Are you all good to keep going for a bit, or?
I have about 5 minutes before I have to get
Oh.
on a building meeting.
So I might toss out one last question then, which I think is really applicable for PEI, and I'd be interested in your experiences. Is like, what do you find is the best way to connect like neighborhoods or buildings that include both like young and like tech savvy tenants, but also people with no access to technology or internet, or just like people who don't really use it at all? Like, how do you, because you could organize like mostly online somehow with a lot of tech savvy people, but then how do you reach the people who have no connection to technology or internet?
I can probably answer this one a little bit, because yeah, a lot of the people that we organize are, you know, it's a broad, we have very like young go-getter activists, the tech savvy people, and then we have people in their like 80s who have never heard of, you know, any of this in their life, and they don't know how to get online, right? Yeah, one thing that we do is, again, also COVID permitting, at the low case numbers in Nova Scotia helps, right? We have people who are tech savvy, and we actually had this program kind of earlier in the pandemic where we would pair people in buildings, or even like neighborhoods who live near each other, and we would have people like who can connect someone on Zoom, come to the house and like sit with them, and then have both people like on camera at the same time. Or we would have people who are on the Zoom and then had someone on speakerphone, you know, being able to listen in, right? And being able to, you know, phone and listen in that way. Yeah, and we also just did a lot of like programs at the beginning to like we did workshops on like how do you use Zoom and how do you get on and like how do you connect with people and organize kind of digitally. And we really targeted that towards buildings where we had like members who are older, right? So we have so now we have a lot of like 16, 70-year-olds who are like were telling me how to use this. But yeah, it is also a challenge, right? You know, having things in person. In the summer, if you can meet outside, go to a park and spread out and be able to talk. It's tough, but you know, there are workarounds.
Yeah, for sure. I would say in general, like face-to-face is key. Like that's the basis for pretty much the majority of the work that we've done. It's door knocking, door to door. It's having meetings in lobbies, having conversations one-on-one with people face-to-face. And that, I mean, obviously that becomes even more important in, you know, a multilingual context where, you know, not everybody's speaking English as a first language and stuff. But yeah, I think COVID obviously presents challenges to that. We did spend a lot of time in the summer having meetings outside with masks and stuff, so that worked fairly well. Winter's harder, obviously. But one simple thing that I've found effective is like we have access to like a conference call line. So basically just a phone number people can call into, and that is a good alternative to people needing an internet connection, for sure. It has been.
Yeah, so for the Mount Pleasant fight, we did a lot of postering. And because it was a ongoing geographical action, people could just show up whenever they wanted. And so you were able to create community in that sense. And yeah, like, you know, weather permitting, meeting outside with masks and stuff like that is definitely important. You know, in the winter, we've started doing phone banking. So calling our members and trying to get in touch with them that way. We did phone banking for an action we did, which was sending postcards to the new housing minister. So basically we called our members and said, hey, do you want to participate? Do you want to send a postcard? We'll send you the postcard. You write your spiel that you want to say to the housing minister, and then you put it in the mailbox. And we had a really good response to that. And yeah, I think like you have to do what you can to reach out in other ways. if anybody wants, advice on phone banking, you can definitely reach out to me. We use Call Hub. It's probably the cheapest option. It can be kind of a pain in the ass to use because it's not super user friendly. But yeah, I'm definitely down to provide any advice on phone banking.
That's awesome.
Oh,
Really
I would-
appreciate that.
Can I hop in about that stuff too? I'll just be quick. So in my building, a lot of people are pretty low income and sometimes don't have phones, often don't have internet. I think one thing to think about is you can lean on already existing social networks to get information out. So and something to think about first is if the people you don't see, that you don't even know you don't see, those are the people you actually need to reach. You need to reach people who are not like you, who don't look like you, who maybe don't speak your language, are not doing the job you do, or sometimes don't even live where you live, especially if you're doing like in PEI where it's less dense, right? And also people who don't work the same hours as you. So I happen to work from home, which is very helpful because I can talk to people at my building at any time. But one thing I do is I try and identify groups of people that not necessarily that I want to infiltrate, but that I want to be involved or that I know that are missing. And you can lean on those social networks. Information will get out if you start trying to get it out there to those groups. And so maybe it's families, maybe it's people who work nights, maybe it's people who speak a certain language, whatever, and figure out how to get information to those people, because they will come and find you if you're visible enough, if you're approachable enough, like Cole said about the newsletter. If you start translating into the dominant languages, if you start using, even within English, using words that people you're trying to reach will understand, like speaking in a certain way or using pictures or whatever. So that's one way. But then also I would say have people have someone that they can call. When you're making connections with people, give them your phone number and they can call you. And almost everyone can get access to a phone somewhere. I have neighbors that live in my building that walk to the library, which is a few blocks away, to call me, and I'm up here in my apartment. They do that, or sometimes they just come and knock on my door, that kind of stuff. But I think in PEI, you have tons of social networks that already exist, especially in the country. People need those. I'm talking about my mom lives outside of Charlottetown. She knows everyone that does every little business nearby. People come and help her with stuff all the time. Those social networks exist already, and you can tap into them and you can reach people that you wouldn't normally reach, especially the elderly.
Yeah, no, for sure. No, that's all really great stuff. I think just in the interest of kind of keeping to a schedule, we might end things there for tonight. And I could thank all of you for speaking. I really appreciate that, and there's a lot of really great information that I think we've all learned from. And for everybody that's watching, over the next few days, I'll probably reach out either over email or phone just to follow up on this. But next week we're having another webinar. It's going to be run by Community Legal Information. It's going to be sort of like a tenant rights, landlord responsibilities workshop. So if you're interested in learning about your rights and what your landlord can't actually do, that'll be next Thursday from 7 to 8 or 7 to 8:30, depending, because we might have another Q&A period about rights if people are interested in that. And then this is a bit of taking what you've learned from here and using it over the course of the next week. Maybe try and just what everybody's been saying, just keep an ear out and talk with your neighbors and see if there's any issues that maybe you didn't realize people were sharing before. But I think that's about the end of it for this week. And yeah, thank you all again.
That's great. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks for all the information and wisdom. It was really useful exchange of information.
Thanks, everyone.
I took some notes and I'm going to share with anyone who wants them. It helped gas me up. That's all I want.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Great.
I think
Thanks for having us. And I really love all these opportunities we get to share knowledge as tenant organizers. I think we should be doing this more often. So like maybe hit me up if you want to organize some sort of like tenant organizer solidarity network across Canada.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Bye guys. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, folks.
Have
Have
a
a
good
nice
night.
evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right. Bye.